tonight, what are the differences between the Republican and Democratic parties? Town meeting.
Welcome, town meeting friends, to historic Town Hall in New York City, where the sound of the moderator's gavel will bring to order another session of America's Town Meeting of the Air. The subject of our discussion tonight: what are the essential differences between the Republican and Democratic parties? As speakers, we are proud to have with us Dr. Glenn Frank, Chairman of the Republican Program Committee, and the Honorable Robert H. Jackson, Attorney General of the United States. May I now present your moderator, Mr. George V. Denny, Jr., President of Town Hall and founder of America's Town Meeting of the Air. Mr. Denny.
Good evening, neighbors. It's frequently said nowadays that the 1940 elections will be the most important held in this country since the Civil War. Certainly, American interest in political, economic, and social questions has never been greater than it is at this time, and there's probably more intelligent interest in public affairs today than have ever been before. In any case, the men between, and by that I mean all of those who listen carefully to both sides and cast their votes for the candidates and platforms they believe will best serve the interests of the country, are watching carefully the activities of both parties and appraising their potential candidates and attitudes on public questions. It's been said also that there were times in this country when the choice of the voters on election day was between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. If that's so today, we ought to know it. However, if we can judge by some of the speeches made from this platform during the past 5 years, there's considerable difference of opinion between the Democratic and Republican parties as presently constituted. Certainly, we've been fortunate in securing the acceptance of these two speakers, Dr. Glenn Frank, Chairman of the Republican Program Committee, and therefore an authoritative spokesman for his party, and the Honorable Robert H. Jackson, Attorney General of the United States, an outstanding spokesman for the present Democratic administration. We are to hear first from Dr. Frank, whose national reputation as an editor and former president of the University of Wisconsin has been enhanced by his work in his present post. I take pleasure in presenting to you Dr. Glenn Frank. Dr. Frank.
Mr. Denny, ladies and gentlemen, I hope my associate, the distinguished Attorney General of the United States, Mr. Jackson, will agree with me that it will be impossible to give much reality to the argument of this evening unless at the outset we define our terms so that it will be perfectly clear what both Mr. Jackson and I mean when we refer to the Republican and Democratic parties. We could talk about the historic record of these two parties as they have operated under fire, when official responsibility has been upon them. We could talk about the traditional philosophies of these two parties, ranging over the policy pronouncements of Hamilton, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Jackson, at least Andrew Jackson. We could, I suspect, give you a fairly colorful evening if we condescended to personalities, historic and contemporary, and centered our attention on isolated party episodes, each undertaking to muckrake the party of the other. But I am not, and I suspect Mr. Jackson is not, interested in any of these approaches to this question. I am not interested in any of these approaches because I think they have little, if any, relevance to the political decisions and practical interests of the American people in 1940. In these later years, life has laid too heavy a hand upon too many of us. Fortune has failed to smile upon too many of us for me to believe that many Americans will cast their votes in 1940 in terms of the history of our two parties. Few emotions will be stirred in 1940 by obsolete slogans or by the waving of faded battle flags woven out of the issues of other generations. Men without a job, staggering under unbearable debt, with their backs bending under a back-breaking taxation, women watching the loss of their homes, and youth staring at doors of opportunity barricaded by a sluggish enterprise are not going to spend much time raking over the ashes and the embers of political history. And of course, the fact is that traditionally, except for variations of emphasis in this decade or that, there have been no essential differences between the Republican and Democratic parties in their political and economic philosophies. Variations, yes, but in essence, both have grounded their governing upon a political philosophy of democratic self-government under the check and counter-check of distributed and balanced powers, an economic philosophy of private enterprise under the minimum governmental regulation necessary to prevent abuse and promote justice in its operation, and, if I may use the term, a spiritual philosophy of civil liberties, under which freedom to think, to write, to speak, to petition, to worship, and to participate in political opposition were supposed to be secure from denial, from vindictive harassment, or assault even by government. Now, I used to think this long-standing similarity between our two parties was to be deplored. I don't any longer. I am now convinced that it's impossible to operate a great nation under the two-party system with any degree of stabilized well-being unless the two parties are in essential agreement on their political and economic philosophies. If a two-party system is made up of two parties whose political and economic philosophies are at opposite poles, then every election overturn becomes in effect a revolution, and the whole national enterprise is disrupted, thrown out of gear, and for a run of years at least, shrouded under a depressing shadow of uncertainty. And surely no effective light would be thrown on the immediate importance of the question we're discussing if Mr. Jackson and I attempted to muckrake our respective parties. Both parties, being made up of human beings, have had their share of great statesmen and crooks. Both have had their phases of high advance and low retreat. Both have at one time or another have served the many and have been exploited by the few, and at varying levels of local, state, and national government have had their share of scandals and of superb service. No, the only difference worth discussing tonight is the difference between the policy and action followed by the New Deal administration during the last 7 years and the policy and action a Republican administration would be likely to follow if the fortunes of balloting returned the Republicans to power next November. Now, you may say that's hardly a fair way to state the question because judgment on the New Deal can be based on a record, while it might be said judgment on the probable policy and action of an incoming Republican administration would have to be in the nature of a prophecy, and that such prophecy made in advance of the platform the Republicans will adopt and the candidate they will nominate at Philadelphia next June can only be a guess. How can anybody know, you may ask? What forces will draft the platform and what behind-the-scenes deals will dictate the leadership at Philadelphia? Now, ordinarily, in any party, both this observation and this question would be valid. But I speak with a feeling of unusual certainty tonight about the probable platform and probable kind of leadership of 1940 Republicanism, because I'm not basing my judgment on a guess about forces that will operate in Philadelphia or deals that might be attempted. I'm basing my judgment on a first-hand knowledge of what the rank and file of Republicans are thinking and feeling today. And what the rank and file of Republicans are thinking and feeling is today more important than what any individual Republican leader is thinking. I think I know what is today moving in the minds and hearts of the mine run of Republicans from coast to coast. I think I know first because I'm one of them. And then for the last 2 years, I've been at a very unusual listening post. As chairman of the Republican Program Committee, I've had the chance to eavesdrop the minds and hearts of thousands upon thousands of rank-and-file Republicans throughout this nation. And unless my hearing's been very bad, I know what these rank-and-file Republicans are saying among themselves. And I say to you tonight that if there is a spirit of blind reaction in the rank-and-file Republicanism of this country, I've been unable to find it with a dragnet of research and referendum in the last 2 years. The rank-and-file Republicans of this country, as I've come to know them in these 2 years, are not hidebound. Neither, thank God, are they harebrained. They are generally and justifiably skeptical of political medicine men. They do not belong to the decay school of thought, which has captured so many official liberals in these later years. These rank-and-file Republicans simply do not believe the assumption current in so many quarters just now that the America we have known, the America of political liberty and private enterprise, is a dying America, except as the political pulmotor of the federal government can keep it breathing. They believe, not as wishful thinking, but as obvious fact, that American enterprise can expand more, can offer more investment opportunities for our savings, can provide more jobs for workers in factories and on farms, create more profitable outlets for the energies and genius of the people, and lift the living standards immeasurably higher in the next 25 years than it did in the 25 years before 1929, if the public policies of government or the private policies of business don't throw too many obstacles in its way. Now, these rank-and-file Republicans don't believe that the ranks of businessmen, industrialists, and bankers are devoid of intelligence, competence, and social sensitiveness. They don't think that the political genius of the nation is bankrupt so far that it has to be put under a receivership of appointed administrators. They believe there's a vast fund of leadership in this nation that is suffering neither from the rigor mortis of reaction nor from the St. Vitus dance of irresponsible utopianism. And they think, and these rank-and-file Republicans think, that it's the business of the Philadelphia Convention to find that sort of leadership so they can follow it and help it lift the standards around which the stable intelligence, the effective competence, and the sound social sense of Americans who believe in democratic self-government and an intelligently modernized system of private enterprise can rally. Now, this rank-and-file Republicanism is not a do-nothing Republicanism. It's not allowing either vested interests or vested ideas to obscure its understanding of these social and economic needs to which political policy must today be related or meet deserved rejection at the hands of an enlightened people. This rank-and-file Republicanism does not want to repeal a single law that has actually restored or strengthened values. It does not want to repeal a single tax that is needed for essential public service, unless it's a tax that is hampering the needed expansion of industry and business upon which every essential service of government ultimately depends. It doesn't want government to wash its hands of concern with the future of agriculture or see labor face management without the full advantage of equal bargaining power. It doesn't want to see homeowners pay exorbitant interest rates or lose their homes. It doesn't want to see a single American go hungry or houseless or cold. It doesn't want to see government relax effort in behalf of the unemployed. And it doesn't want to see the country handed over to the manipulations of dishonest speculators. It doesn't want to delay by one unnecessary hour the utmost feasible security for the aged or sabotage any intelligent attempt to raise the standards of health and education. Now, this rank-and-file Republicanism of 1940, as I've come to see it, is an alert, eager, socially sensitive, progressive Republicanism. And any leadership that undertakes to thwart it or fails faithfully to express it will be broken.
Frank. One of the most distinguished members of the present administration is the Attorney General of the United States, a native of Jamestown, New York, and successively Assistant Attorney General and Solicitor General, and a distinguished and an eminent Democrat. I take pleasure in welcoming back to the Town Hall platform the Honorable Robert H. Jackson. Mr. Jackson.
Citizens of the town meeting, since the subject for tonight was chosen, world events have made the differences between us Americans seem trivial, beside those deep differences of systems and cultures that men are dying for abroad. We, Dr. Frank, may be grateful that our differences are only those which can be settled at the ballot box. And while we differ in detail, we have no disagreement in wanting to continue the fundamental principles of our government and of our society. In fact, Dr. Frank and I agree on too many points to make this a real jolly evening for you. Before the New Deal, there was frequent complaint by thoughtful people, some liberal and some conservative, that there was no real difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Since the Democratic Party has been under the leadership of President Roosevelt, that complaint has been less frequent. Nearly every partisan Democrat and nearly every partisan Republican agree that there are fundamental differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican opposition. But it is difficult to get them to agree on a statement of these fundamental differences. If a man from Mars should examine the New Deal record and then read the modernized statement of Republican doctrine prepared by Dr. Frank and his battalion of brain trusters, 200 experts strong, he might conclude that Dr. Frank's work was a defense of the Roosevelt record. Certainly he would conclude that most of the ideas discussed by Dr. Frank came from President Roosevelt. The Republican program of Dr. Frank accepts in principle minimum wage and maximum hour legislation, federal subsidies to agriculture, soil conservation, a housing program, the elimination of tax-exempt securities, the regulation of stock markets, security issues and public utilities, and even government competition to some extent in the power industry. It favors such bitterly contested policies as collective bargaining for labor, reciprocal trade agreements, relief for the unemployed, and the Social Security program. It is content if the budget is balanced and not before the election of 1942, and is content if we return to a fixed gold standard at some indefinite date. There are, to be sure, guarded suggestions in the report that the New Deal record is not perfect, and that there remains much to be done to satisfy the promise of American life. But such criticisms are, on the whole, more tempered than many I have heard from New Dealers. There is nothing in the Glenn Frank document that suggests a fundamental difference in objective or approach from Mr. Roosevelt. Our man from Mars might well wonder whether the Republican brain trusters could find a better leader to fight for their principles in 1940 than Franklin D. Roosevelt. I do not want to give an exaggerated impression of the wholeheartedness of the committee's endorsement of the New Deal. There are plenty of hedge clauses in the report which can be cited to convince reactionaries and contributors that the road back to normalcy has not been cut off. One of the most forceful illustrations is the proposal to return to the Mellon system of taxation. Every tax imposes some economic burden on those who pay it. The historic position of the Democratic Party is that this burden should be placed where it can most easily be carried, and that taxes should increase in proportion to ability to pay. In this respect, although it advocates budget balancing, Dr. Frank's report proposes to lower the taxes on the higher incomes. It proposes the repeal of the capital stock tax and the repeal of the excess profits tax and repeal of the normal tax on dividends. It is very significant that not a single proposal is made to lighten the burden of the income tax or any other tax on the wages, salaries, or earned income. The only tax relief proposed is to those who are living on investments rather than on their services to society. A similarly reactionary position is taken by the committee with respect to government relief and work for the unemployed. The committee proposes, to the largest extent feasible, to take this burden from the federal government, which can tax incomes and inheritances, and to place it on local governments, which can effectively tax nothing much but real estate and retail sales. The people will not and should not stand for more sales taxes, and real estate taxes have already been carried to the breaking point for the poor and middle-class homeowners. To put the cost of relief on real estate means to end relief. Even under our present system, the Republican-governed state of Ohio has witnessed relief riots. A cruel society cannot be a stable society, and I want to live in a stable and peaceable order. If our federal government ceased to aid the unemployed, the aged, and the farmer, our civilization would become at once the richest and the most cruel in modern history. We must balance our economic system with a purchasing power equivalent to our producing power. Also, we must boldly face the problem of how to preserve equality of economic opportunity and political democracy in the face of the rising power and influence of great accumulations and combinations of wealth. The real powers in the Republican Party contend, and I think that they honestly believe, that economic opportunity and security for the great majority of our citizens is unattainable by government effort. They still cherish the belief that government help can be sound and effective only if it trickles down from above and takes the form of tariffs, subsidies, tax relief, and other incentives to those already on the upper scales of the economic ladder. I do not mean, of course, to suggest that there are not many things that government may properly do to energize private enterprise. But there is a difference between those of us who believe that the task of government is to promote the general welfare and those who believe that government should only help those best able to take care of themselves. What therefore distinguishes New Deal democracy from its opponents is that we would use the powers of government in a conscious effort to attain and to distribute a high level of production and prosperity, not for a few, but for the many. To understand the differences between the two major parties, we must look not only at their words, but their deeds. I am well aware that the promises of statesmen of all parties excel their performance. But it is fair to look at the promises and performances of the Republican Party when it was in power, and the promises and performances of the Democratic Party under President Roosevelt. We find a distinct difference in the approach and attitude of the two major parties toward the government's responsibility to its people. It may not be easy to state this difference, but it is very real in the minds and hearts of the voters. Is it unfair to doubt whether the objective of the Dr. Frank report, which the Dr. Frank report accepts in principle, represents the real attitude of men who were hostile or indifferent when President Roosevelt and his party were struggling to write into law such requirements as that of truth in the sale of securities, fair play on the stock exchanges, a limitation of the right of super utility holding companies to play with other people's property, the right of workers to bargain collectively, the provision of jobs instead of a dole for the unemployed, the right to unemployment and to old age insurance. Is it unfair to ask when, and for what reason, those who bitterly opposed or grudgingly accepted these great reforms decided that they want to improve them and extend them and administer them better? If the Republicans now concede these principles to be sound and wise, why has President Roosevelt's effort to put them into practical effect won him such deep and lasting hatreds from the financial backers of the Republican Party. Dr. Frank's report does not sharpen or define these real underlying issues between the two parties as now constituted and led. It is to be feared that the party platforms, if they are made up of the usual timid generalities, will also fail to disclose their really opposite objectives. The intuition of the people will sense the difference better than it can be stated. President Roosevelt has more than once warned against these smooth evasions of the real issues, which say to us, of course we believe in all these things. We believe in Social Security. We believe in work for the unemployed. We believe in saving homes. Cross our hearts and hope to die. We believe in all of these things. But we do not like the way the present administration is doing them. Just turn them over to us. We will do all of them. We will do more of them. We will do them better. And most important of all, the doing of them will not cost anybody anything. The next administration may deal with severe tensions in our society. Its dominant task will be to re-examine governmental policies in the light of our experience. We must complete a long-term program to take the place of short-term remedies and emergency experiments. Although we stand aside from the European conflict, our economy, our social life, and our thinking will not escape its far-reaching effects. Victory will bring prestige to the ideas and the systems and the doctrines of a successful country. We must face the peace of Europe, which may test our stability even more than the war of Europe. We do not know what modifications of their way of life and what reorganization of their economy even the democracies of Europe may make in order to win the war. Ideas or practices that bring victory will exert new pressures. In this competition of ideas and loyalties, our system of representative democracy belatedly has undertaken to provide economic opportunity and security for all of our people. There is no wisdom in turning back. There is no time to waste. It is later than you think.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Before our question period, we pause now for station identification.